just for the record, yeah, I was going to open it up by saying that I made a presentation on Scrooge last week, and Jeff and I are now going to have a discussion about it. Not only that, we invite others to join the discussion because I want to say why I think it's momentous. So I got your text, Jeff, by the way, saying that you didn't think that my no-brainer is a no-brainer. So let me get right to that. Yeah, I want to claim that there's a certain attitude that some of us have, and it falls in with the prophetic tradition in Judaism. It falls in with a lot of the spiritual revolutionaries that we have seen historically, the Isaiah movement up to and including apparently Jesus himself, the great peace movement, which is predicated on the proposition that the way we're living makes no sense. That if we were somehow able to make a quantum leap into simply a more empathic way or mode or mood of existence, then, and whatever that would take, by the way, would it take a shock to the system, adjustment of our chemicals, chemical engineering of various kinds, genetic engineering of various kinds, maybe. But I mean, what is wrong with us? I want to say it is no brainer. Let me put it to you in another context just to begin the conversation, Jeff. As a philosophy professor, I like proof. And when I turn to the idea of proof of an idea, like all great philosophers, I, not a great philosopher, must follow suit and see that mathematics, for example, if you could prove something as it were mathematically, but that's the thing. We even have in mathematical form proofs of the proposition that the antagonistic mode of human existence based upon mutual antipathy, or at least mistrust, makes no sense. Everybody scores better points in all regards by jumping to a different game called a cooperative game, where we have mutual regard and care about each other. What happens is that there's a revolution that occurs in some people, and this is what I see in Scrooge, the realization that the way I have been living actually makes no sense. It's good for nobody, and it's certainly no good for me. Does me no good whatsoever. I create the miserable existence that I am by doing so. The obvious, yes, it is a no-brainer too. It's the theme of all of our movies. Love is supposed to conquer all. The idea that that is the ultimate good, if we could only do it, if that could be the way in which we regarded each other, partying with one another rather than destroying each other. I want to repeat that Dickens is big on partying. But if we could have somehow that one small change in our predisposition, and where does it come from? Does it come out of our carnivorous past? Well, I mean, why is it some animals are not?
Well, you've led just into where the reason why I mentioned in my text back to you about it's not a no-brainer, in that compassion requires all of your brain and a considerable amount of rational thought. And in order to make my point here, a little bit of brain physiology is necessary. The world that we live in, what are the primary things we need to do to live? We have to eat, we have to have shelter, and at some point we have to reproduce. If you look at the basic brain, at the center of your brain, sitting right on top of your spinal column, is what's called your limbic system. And the limbic system is basically, can be evolutionarily traced back to a lizard. The lizard lives by three things. It eats, it defends itself with either a flight or fight response, and it reproduces. That is the basis of what lies at the center of the human brain. Now, wrapped around that is a considerably larger cerebrum. More importantly, it's the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. And that is where judgment, reason comes from. In order for you to realize what you're saying, your cerebrum must override your limbic system, because your limbic system is telling you you need to grab all the food you can get. You need to grab all the territory you can get so you're safe. You need to aggressively defend yourself against other things that would hurt you. That's what lies at the center of your brain. The only thing that overrides that is your frontal lobe. And it's a continual fight between your frontal lobe and your limbic system as to what will win out. So the no-brainer is basically acting like Scrooge lived, because it takes a considerable amount of reasoning and a lot of thought processes to really be compassionate. Compassion is not a no-brainer. It's something that you have a young grandchild. What you find in young children when they reach about the age of 1 or 2, everything is mine. They don't do sharing well. Sharing is not intuitive. Being nice is not intuitive. They literally have to be taught that. Parents have to teach their children that they need to be compassionate. They need to be concerned about other people. It is not innate in the human brain. So my thoughts are that something dramatic had to happen to Scrooge in order for him to override everything that was coming from the center of his limbic brain, to make him realize that the better way to live is with compassion and with joy.
Well, yeah, but first of all, almost all of humanity, left to its own devices, most of us, I look out upon the streets around me and the people are very happy to live nonviolent lives and have really no big difficulty holding their limbic systems to civilized standards, making use of that limbic system for many of its pursuits. We need it, God knows. It's our animal basis, you might say. I agree. But it's that old, I guess I subscribe to that old Platonic theory of Plato, in which the cognitive side can have supervenient rational control. That doesn't mean those other aspects of intelligence aren't there, but it does mean that they subserve intelligent purposes. I think most of us, I think humanity is very advanced in certain ways, that it can understand that a life of violence makes no sense. Most people aren't predisposed to it. To me, it's a big problem. Big question is what's holding us back. I don't think most people are predisposed to violent solutions at all. I think we know what that means. It's harder to describe, but yes, let's admit, we do know that there is such a thing as a human being who is predisposed toward violent type solutions. And, a lot of study goes into these questions. The Pentagon, obviously, is where game theory becomes very interesting, where it always turns out that peace strategies are preferable whenever they can be implemented, and that peace building and peace maintenance is always the best strategy for all concerned. That's a very important finding. It really is a finding of game theory. It occurs in that whole discussion of the prisoner's dilemma that's been going on since about 1950 in game theory. Nobel prizes have been awarded to 15 or 20 different mathematicians, economists, and whatnot for the work that has gone into games, competitive scenarios, and so forth, showing that cooperation, whenever possible, is to everybody's benefit. It's a math. That's what my mathematical point was. I was searching for a way to say why it's a no-brainer, And the philosopher in me says, look, I can even come up with a mathematical proof. We turn to game theory. We talk about the prisoner's dilemma, and I show you that peace strategy, mutual encouragement and maintenance of peace is the key to everybody having a better life. Caring about maintaining that and more, and it involves a lot more. It involves actually the cultivation. What Scrooge discovers is that it's a no-brainer, that he finds joy now and only now when he has taken that leap outside that other form of existence and into one of mutual regard, that he, for the first time, experiences joy itself. If that's the proposition, if my only joy is to be found in a world in which, if we were able to take such a quantum leap, we simply went ahead and did it, then it is a no-brainer, but it is also your no-brainer on the other side. There's an antinomy here.
Well, you mentioned that, and I totally agree with you. There are any number of people walking around that are very compassionate and content with their lives. But if you look at who those people are, those are all people that have solved the three basic problems of the limbic system. They have food, they have shelter, they can reproduce whenever they want. They have the luxury of playing games and thinking about whether they need to be compassionate or not. I think you'd get a different answer if you were talking to a tribesman in Africa who was living at a subsistence level in a hut as to what his priorities were. He wouldn't have the luxury of having all those problems that his limbic system deals with solved. Once you solve those problems, you can live in your cerebrum.
But such peoples always have more to gain by mutual trust and maintaining mutual trust. Whenever two different peoples come into contact with one another, it doesn't have to be that way. It breaks down very often. Sometimes it doesn't exist in the first place. But it always is beneficial whenever it is given that real try and allowed to develop. It's always beneficial for people to interact favorably toward one another. Scrooge discovers that he was lost without the joys of this. And if this is the only place in which we can find our joy, it is a no-brainer, people like me think, that we aren't there already. I think that the great Isaians, from Isaiah to Jesus, if you will, through Jonah, let's not forget, and others, the whole prophetic tradition, I mean, there's something here, it could be wrong. I want to read that Cormac McCarthy quotation on the other side. For McCarthy, he took a very grim view of things. And I don't want to say I disrespect him at all. This is the subject that calls for deep thought. I don't have an answer, but no, let me just finish the question, though. Is it, in fact, to speak the truth, a dog-eat-dog world that we'll never get out of? Let's face facts. Is it that? And with brutal honesty, some would say yes. And they would add perhaps the writer, or at least not in my own lifetime, as if that is the only thing to care about. No. So the question is it a no-brainer that we would be better off in a world of peace? Or is it a no-brainer that we'll never get there, that the world is not such, that we're not made of the kind of stuff?
Well, I would look at Dickens's book as the game plan of what has to happen. If you look at the whole story, there's a considerable amount of cognitive thought that has to go into Scrooge's decision after the final ghost. Look at everything he was led through, the whole nature of the story that's buried in the plot of the four ghosts and everything, before Scrooge finally realizes, by understanding a number of different things, that to be joyful and compassionate is a better way to live. It didn't come naturally to him. He literally had to be taught. And the whole reason for Dickens's story is, what processes do you have to use to have people come to that realization.
Well, in a certain sense, his answer is a certain kind of psychoanalysis. We learn in the story what works for Scrooge is that he has to go back and re-examine, for example, his childhood. That's crucial because as a child, he was able to take joy in these things and he loses it. There's that crucial scene where the engagement with his fiancée gets broken up. She allows him out of it. And we see a progression of Scrooge from an early stage in which he had all the capacity for joy and could have gone a completely different way, and the later Scrooge who makes the swerve in the direction of business and money. So that's all. And this is very interesting, of course, because it is being written in 1843 in anticipation of some Freudian themes that only through an addressing of our own self-history, especially going back at those critical junctures in our life, only by reviewing our own past and seeing it, past, present, and yet to come, paraded in front of us. My God, what a thing. What a nightmare it was for him to see his whole life paraded in front of him. And maybe that kind of shock, and now I want to emphasize that concept, that Dickens forces on us, that only a shock to the system can do the trick. I don't know whether that's true, but it's a proposition with these nightmares that Scrooge suffers. It's a proposition that Dickens lays before us. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do you think there's anything relevant to the fact that he wrote this around Christmas?
Oh, yeah. He was going for it.
Does Christmas have a significance in it?
But of course, it's Dickens' take on what he says so at the beginning. It's a good time. Dickens isn't afraid to use the simplest of language at times, but then he rounds it out. By the way, I have my copy here somewhere around. Yeah, there it is. And it has the bookmark that you gave me in it. But he does speak in the opening passages very directly to that. And a lot of what happens in the way our culture, after Dickens, celebrate Christmas is influenced by this story. It was a somewhat secondary holiday, the historians tell us, until in early Victorian times a change occurred. But what was I looking for here?
Why Christmas?
Why Christmas? Yes. Well, I'll have to find the passage. I'm not going to take the time to do it right this second, but it is, of course, a Christmas story. It's called A Christmas Carol. It's about the essence of, from Dickens' point of view, the essence of what it is to be a Christian. And Dickens is decidedly not on the doctrinal side. You and I have had this conversation. Couldn't give a hoot about doctrinal differences. Being a Christian meant having a certain kind of attitude toward life, that love and loving relations among human beings beat everything else. And that there's a gospel here. It is a gospel of love. And it's a gospel about the fact that the world can be transformed in that way of love. And they trace this back to the teachings of Jesus with good reason. There's a lot of that there, but Jesus himself can be traced back in his essential orientation to the great prophets, a tradition to which he would have insisted that he belonged.
Well, there is one of the things that makes sense to me in my looking at other religions, specifically Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and to a certain extent, Zoroastrianism, all maintain that in order to lead a blissful, harmonic life, it requires work. It requires effort. It doesn't come naturally. You have to do things to remind yourself of what's the right thing to do. You have to have certain guidelines that you need to know. And I take this and contrast it against Christianity. I won't say anything about Judaism, but in Christianity, there's a degree of magical thinking that says, if I say the right words, if I profess the right faith, then everything will be fine. The world will magically become a better place. I will magically become a better person. And if I do the right magical things, things will be, if I go to church every Sunday, it really doesn't matter what I do for the rest of the week. But if I go to church, if I take my kids to church, there's this magical thinking that the act itself will make me a better person and the world a better place. And it turns out that just doesn't happen. In order to lead a compassionate, contemplative life, you must continually think about it. It requires work and also the help of other people.
But it's not just contemplative, it's above all learning the art of loving each other, the art of human love in the richest possible sense. It's a multi-leveled thing. There's a whole lot of psychology. There's a whole lot of learning of that goes on in this. But thankfully, a lot of us understand it already. I keep wanting to come back to a certain point that we've come a long way already. I have a certain kind of insistence that there's no good reason why now, civilized people knowing what we know, we didn't know enough to begin to take earnest steps in actually instituting problem solving in the world, insisting on institutions of problem solving in the world that made the crude kinds of situations that we find actually going on. We could be talking about Russia and Ukraine. We could be talking about Israel and Hamas. We could be talking about anything these days. Nothing is above evaluation. And the signal point here is the question that some of us, admittedly on the sidelines, keep throwing out. Isn't there a better way? Don't you see that everybody loses by doing things this way, and that everybody would gain if we could take that magical little step toward each other, which made the next step toward each other? Game theoreticians talk about this too, how step by step we can be drawn into cooperative patterns of behavior. And yeah, there's a lot of learning that goes on in trying to figure out how to create a world like that. Medicine, in fact, are there certain people who are so psychopathic that only certain kinds of medicines? Well, I don't disapprove. In our culture, which uses medicine in so many different ways, that too has to be a subject of discussion. Is it just that a certain kind of foul mood possesses certain kinds of people who are the ones who really are prone to violence? Really, they don't constitute a large number of the population, but they do exist. Whereas the rest of us, no. The rest of us actually are peaceable creatures already, I would maintain, and are just looking for a way to bring it about.
Well,
what we know.
To relate this back to the teachings of Jesus and the prophets, as you mentioned, this is built into what you're talking about here is how do you treat your neighbor? You're talking about how you recognize other people and how you treat them. And Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan that we sometimes misinterpret because we don't understand the nature of the Samaritan in the parable. But Jesus tells us that our neighbor is that person that we don't necessarily like, that we think is doing the wrong thing. But he's your neighbor and you need to treat him the way you do other people. And then the parable of the prodigal son challenges our view of fairness. Every time I hear people talk of it's not fair, this and that, it comes back to the world's not operating the way I think it should operate. And here we see in that parable the older son that did all the right things. It's really a parable about the second son, not necessarily the prodigal son. The older son did all the right things, stayed with his father. Yet when the son who went off and had his wild fling and squandered all of his money came back, the father showed him an infinite amount of grace. And the older son was upset with that because it just wasn't fair. He was there, did all the right things, and here comes the other son back and receives his father's grace. And he doesn't like that. And it's these two things together that, to me, highlight the fact that you have to constantly fight your limbic system. You have to think and reason and use the better part of your brain in order to overcome your initial reactions to things and what you think is a sense of fairness. And to me, in Dickens's story, there's an awful lot of karma. Scrooge goes back and he sees the things that he did that harmed people. And he saw the negative effects of karma and how it spread, even to him. And he realizes that that's not the way to do it. So to me, there's a bit of karma in the story as well.
You know, as a sidelight, I would say I think that's true. I've lately been drawn to the thought that the idea of karma and the idea of the existence of the Jewish God are also the same idea. That you basically, and it's that old thing, it's really a no-brainer in itself, that of course you reap what you sow. How could it be otherwise? How could it be otherwise than what you get is what you did? You know? Next part of the story is up to you, and then it happens all over again. No, karma is the basic idea of a moral, that somehow the world does have a moral adjustment to it, that evil deeds produce an evil existence, which produce evil deeds, which produce and round in a circle. And on the other side, that loving acts produce a loving world, which nurtures on itself. Each logic is a logic unto itself. But our tradition says that the one founded upon love and ending the violence, the meaningless, ultimately meaningless violence, that's what it's all about. I see finally the story of Scrooge, of why do we allow this world of violence around us to exist any longer? You mentioned cultural factors, people in different cultures, apparent forms of scarcity and so forth. I'm not convinced in my social studies that Malthus is right about some ultimate lacking of resources. No, I think we can address problems of human hunger. There's so many ways in which we waste money getting people so that they could have some food on the table, and working out rational systems of agriculture, which is what you really need, encouraging people in various ways through cooperative measures. People love it. Americans would love to go abroad, those and share and enjoy. A world like that where people start to meet other people, very international world. I expect of the future, by the way. I think of the kids these days. I think of the need for an international movement of kids predicated upon a new way of looking at things and the whole role of violence in life. I'm talking about my children and my grandchildren now. But I think they have every right not to be willing to stand for it any longer. And to think that there are steps that we can take to move away from that model, the bad mathematical model of antagonism, into the one that makes sense for everybody. So in that sense, I take it to be a no-brainer. But about the future, like all the prophets, I agree with what they say. And yet, how do we ever get out of this world? We are the whole paradox is that we're stuck in this other world. And it seems that only a quantum leap and how do we take such a leap could get us out of it. It sustains itself. Its logic sustains itself. And how are we moving? I want to quote a true problem posed by a truly fine writer named Cormac McCarthy. I think this is from an interview. I jotted it down. This is the Cormac McCarthy quote, which I take to be a wonderful way of phrasing the challenge. He says, "There is no such thing as life without bloodshed. I think that the notion that the species can be improved in some way, that everyone could live in harmony, is a really dangerous idea." And of course, you can understand what McCarthy means by calling it a dangerous idea. You just leave yourself open to be exploited yourself if you don't get real to the fact that the world just ain't like that. That it is a dog-eat-dog world. We back to the noir movie, and everybody's out for himself, and make no mistake about that. And all this dreamy stuff, all Dickens' form of Christianity, a world that had gone through a revolution in understanding the importance of living its social life differently. Well, it's not. The person who calls himself the realist, I take it that McCarthy would, and it is real, in describing actual reality. That's what I want to emphasize, is the other side. They have a very strong argument. The argument is called reality. The world is that way. The dog-eat-dog world, which is the antithesis of the world that I'm describing, the dog-eat-dog world is the actual world still. So far, and McCarthy goes so far as to say, and don't leave yourself open to being exploited, killed, or whatnot in such a world by dreaming dreams of peace. No, you're better off carrying a gun. So that's a way of looking at things. And you know what? That's where the conversation has to occur. I think that we have to talk about that at length.
And I think that's probably, looking at where we're at right now, that's probably a good place to stop.
All right, let's just say to be continued on these subjects, okay?
We will continue on with a number of different things, but yes.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.